Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm David Lamb. I'm the director of the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. Very happy you could join us today for the next installment in our ISR Insights speaker series. For those of you who are unfamiliar with ISR, we have over 300 affiliated faculty from over 20 academic disciplines and almost every unit at the University of Michigan. We serve as a hub for rigorous social science research across a wide range of topics, including wealth and inequality, race and racism, politics and public opinion, teen drug use, economic behavior, aging and health, and much more. The goal of this ISR Insights speaker series is to create a forum for disseminating research findings of our ISR faculty. A few housekeeping notes before we begin today. Please note that Zoom offers live transcription of the meeting. You can enable this for yourself by clicking the closed captioning button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Today we're hosting a discussion between two speakers. For the best viewing experience, we recommend that you enable the speaker view instead of gallery view. This should be available to the top right corner of your Zoom screen. That will keep both of our speakers in your view. We'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. You'll notice the chat feature is disabled, so please use the Q&A feature to send in your questions. You can send them at any time during the presentation. We'll do our best to answer them before our time ends. Finally, note that recordings of all of our Insights events are posted on our website, isr.umich.edu, along with information about our upcoming talks. Please check there and follow ISR on Twitter at UMISR to stay connected. So turning to today's talk, I have the great pleasure of introducing our speakers. Ethan Kross is a professor in the University of Michigan Psychology Department and the Ross School of Business. He directs the Emotion and Self-Control Lab. He's a faculty associate in ISR's Research Center for Group Dynamics. His research examines how people can control their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors to improve their lives. Ethan is joined today by Dave Mayer, professor in the Management and Organizations area at the Ross School of Business. Today, drawing from Ethan's latest book, which is entitled Chatter, Ethan and Dave will discuss behavioral and brain research from Ethan's Emotion and Self-Control Lab and real-world case studies, explaining how conversations shape our lives, work, and relationships. This talk is co-sponsored by one of our favorite local bookshops in Ann Arbor, Literati Bookstore. If you're interested in learning more about or purchasing Ethan's book, you can visit the Literati website, literatibookstore.com to do so. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I'll now turn things over to Ethan and Dave. Ethan and Dave, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. Thanks for the nice introduction. This is super fun for me. I'm thrilled to be here with my colleague, my good friend, Ethan Kross. Ethan, I was preparing for this, I was thinking about like all of our talks, chatter related on our jogs, albeit slow jogs, bike rides, walks through the ARB. And I'm just, really happy, overjoyed for you for the success of Chatter, and just really proud of you for all your hard work getting to this point.
Yeah, well, very kind of you to say, Dave, and I could think of no one else to be engaged in a discussion about this with. So we've kicked this off with a love fest, I guess. This is how to roll.
Exactly.
It's all good. Let me add one other note of love before before we get going into the nitty gritty of the brain when it comes to Chatter, which is, the Go Blue. This is home turf. So I would just supplement what David said before about if you have any questions about things that we've talked about, you don't just have to read the book or visit my lab. You can also email me direct and send over the questions, and I'd love to engage you all in discussion. So, all right, back to you, Dave.
All right. Well, let's dive right in, and we'll talk about some of the difficult times many people are having now, in the present with COVID, and then we'll step back after and learn a little bit more about you and what inspired you to write the book, and then ultimately, what can we do to reduce chatter in our lives? So we're at somehow at the 1 year mark of COVID. for many parents who are out there. If our kids aren't back to school, we are ready for them to be in the classroom. Hopefully, as faculty members, we're missing our colleagues. I know I do. We know anxiety and depression rates are quite high. We see this with our students. And I've heard you talk about this, Ethan, as the kind of chatter event of the century around COVID. And I know you've done some research specifically on COVID and who has responded best emotionally. And I'd love for you to talk about that research, and then also maybe some of the surprising findings about when we talk to others and when we vent, and whether that's effective or not.
Sure. Okay. Well, let me start by just telling people here how I think what chatter is, and then I'll dive into how it relates to COVID and chatting with other people about our chatter. So when we experience problems in our life, we tend to focus inward to make sense of our problems, to find solutions. But as many listeners, viewers have probably experienced, those attempts to turn inward often backfire. We end up ruminating and worrying and catastrophizing. And it's that state of perseverating over negative experiences, whether they be the past or the future or things we're going through right now, that I call chatter. It's that feeling of getting stuck where we're trying to find a solution, but we're not getting there. Now, I started working on this. I've been studying this topic for 20 years. I started writing this book about 4 years ago. And if you had asked me at the outset of that process to give you the ingredients for the perfect chatter storm for the planet, I'd be giving you what we've been living through for the past year, right? A once in a century pandemic that is uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen, although we have more insight now, which is good. We have there's a lack of control. We can't really change things ourselves. We've also been living through economic uncertainty and political discord. And so all of these factors have converged to make it really tough, to give us a lot of problems to spend time thinking about. And we've got a lot of time to think right now because we're isolated and removed from our colleagues and friends. So these are challenging times. And as you said before, by current estimates, anxiety and depression is 3 times what it was this time last year. And we know chatter plays a role in those conditions. So these are tricky times. One of the things we've been trying to do is figure out, well, what are the things that people are doing to help them regulate their anxiety during the pandemic? One theme of the book is that there are no single magic pills. I really truly believe in something called a toolbox approach to coping. And the idea there is that we have evolved to possess multiple tools to manage what's happening inside our head. There are things we can do on our own, ways of changing the way we think about the situation that can make us feel better. There are ways of interacting with other people that can be useful. There are even ways of navigating the physical world around us that can really help alleviate our anxiety. But there's no single one magic bullet. You want to use different combinations of tools to really help yourself feel better. And in one nationally representative sample that we just studied for 2 weeks, we measured their anxiety every day, and we also asked them to report which of 17 different healthy and unhealthy strategies they used each day. What we found was really strong evidence for this idea of no magic bullets. What we found is that people tend to use combinations of coping strategies each day. And the healthier the coping strategy cocktail, if you will, the more they experienced anxiety reduction. And the findings were actually compelling. So the people in our study who used the healthiest combination of coping strategies, and I'll tell you a little bit about what those were in a second, they experienced on average a 32% reduction in daily anxiety compared to folks who used the most unhealthy blend of strategies. In terms of the things that actually were working for people, some of the things were obvious, some were less so. So exercise, focusing on the big picture, like thinking about how you're going to feel 6 months from now when the pandemic ends and we're vaccinated. Interacting with other people directly, engaging them in conversation, were all really helpful tools to use together. Unhealthy things were things like venting, and I'll tell you a little bit more about venting in a second. So just unloading how we feel to other people, despite the very strong popular belief that that's a good thing. There's a ton of science which suggests that venting alone doesn't actually improve our chatter, and in some cases can make it worse. And we found evidence for that in this study. We also found things like the usual suspects, drinking, eating to feel better, were harmful too. Suppression, trying to just avoid our anxiety, didn't help either. Let me pause there though, because that's a mouthful. Maybe you have some follow-up questions, and I don't think I hit on everything you wanted me to answer.
Yeah, so I think that's really useful for thinking, well, one, there's not one thing that we need to do. There's a collection of things, and some of them are more using how we move our bodies and being outside. And I want to come back to this more social piece around how we go to other people for help, because I think it's conventional wisdom that, like sometimes the idea that you just need to blow off some steam and to get it out. And, we know books like Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, and that, there are gender differences on whether we want solutions or just to talk.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm trying to think, as a colleague or a friend or a partner or as a parent, what does that mean about venting? And if venting's not great, how do we sort of nudge in a direction that might be more useful?
So when we approach other people for help with our chatter, other people can be really, really helpful or harmful, which is interesting because if you look at what the CDC and other public health organizations often talk about, they just say, just talk about your emotions, right? But they don't really tell us how to do so, and how we talk to people, turns out, based on the science, can make a big difference. And so what you ideally want to have happen when you approach someone else for chatter support is two things. You want to find someone who will allow you to talk a little bit about your emotions. They'll let you express what you're feeling. Knowing that there's someone there who's willing to listen to us, to really empathize with us, right? That does wonders for our relationship. It makes us feel close and connected, enhances our friendship bonds, and leads us to feel good in the moment. So expressing our feelings can feel good when we're doing it, as I think many people have experienced. The issue is that if that is all you do, if all you're doing is venting, you and I are feeling really great during that conversation, but I then leave the conversation and I haven't done anything to reframe how I'm thinking about the problem. And so there's lots of laboratory research which shows that when people engage in what we call co-rumination, or these collective vent sessions, that leads the people involved in them to feel really good about one another. So Dave, I love chatting with you about my misery, right? But then I leave the conversation and I'm talking to myself because I'm still upset about it, because we're enhancing the accessibility of these negative thoughts in our head.
And I noticed you're good at catching it too, because there's been times where we're talking and, an issue comes up and you're like, yeah, oh, we're co-ruminating, and you actually catch it.
Yeah, I try to be very mindful of it, because the seductive allure of just venting and keep going, it does feel good in that moment. I will remind people who are watching, though, there are many things we do that feel good in the moment that aren't necessarily good for us long term, right? And venting is one of them. So venting feels good, doesn't help us address the problem. So what you additionally want to have happen is have that conversation do one additional thing, which is the person you're talking to actually tries to help you put your problem in perspective, reframes the problem. So Dave, if you're bemoaning the fact that you've been trying to teach and do research while you've got two little kids at your ankles gnawing at your shoelaces the whole time, this may or may not be a true experience.
This doesn't sound like me at all.
This doesn't sound like you. There are things that I can do, right? Like, so, all right, Dave, that sounds awful, but look, 4 or 5 months from now, we're going to be vaccinated and back to business, right? Or, you know what? My kids are doing the same thing, and here's how I'm dealing with it. I'm giving them breaks and blah, blah, blah. There are ways that I could try to nudge you to subtly shift how you're thinking about this experience, to get you out of just focusing or dwelling on the negativity, which really can just perpetuate the chatter. And it was interesting to see that play out in these studies we just did on COVID. I mean, it was really this wonderful conceptual replication of what we've seen in decades of research on the hazards of venting play out in the context of COVID. So
Yeah.
let me just be super clear. Expressing your emotions serves a valuable function, but that is not the only thing you want to do when you're struggling with chatter, when you're worried or ruminating about something. You want to express and then take the next step to try to reframe. And I think knowing about these principles of what makes conversations work puts people in a better position to try to seek out the right people, to find them, to give them support when they're struggling. So I'm really, really deliberate about who I approach, for who I talk to about things I'm, ruminating or worried about. There are many people who I love and who I think love me, who I don't talk to about these issues, but there are others that I do. You're one of them. I approach you to get. You're a great chatter advisor, right? So you do both of these things, I think, really well. And so knowing the science, I think, can allow us to be a lot more deliberate about how we seek out support in our lives, but also how we try to provide it to other people as well. And so I certainly use this information to try to steer me when I'm talking with someone else.
Yeah,
Maybe you can comment on how well or bad I do in that
you're
regard.
good. No, it's tricky, right? So this is like nuanced advice, because there's a level of empathy for what someone's going through.
Yeah.
And then, something showing that you can relate in some way, but then also moving into bigger picture, maybe some tactical, concrete things that you've done. And so I think that's really useful. And I'm noticing like a couple of questions in the Q&A around this, about thinking of particularly idea, if we think that there's a toolkit, that the people who tend to do best do several things. But when you're not necessarily feeling at your best, the idea that I need to do 5 or 6 of these things, can feel overwhelming. So, what is that proper cocktail? And what do you say to someone who says, I can go on the walk outside, but all this other stuff feels like a lot?
That's a great question. And, I think what science has done really well up to this point is study these individual strategies. So we know how the individual strategies work under different conditions for different people, what the mechanisms of action are. What we haven't yet done and are just beginning to do is study how these strategies come together, how they combine and how they interact. What are the unique cocktails? Are there different cocktails that work for different people in different situations? So for me, when it comes to COVID, there are like 4 things I do. I think about the big picture in the future. I talk to my chatter advisor, so to speak. I go for walks in nature. I do a ritual. Like there are 4 or 5 things that I do that work really well there. I do other things in other contexts. I wish I had the science to convey to the folks who are asking, this is exactly the blend of strategies that you should use. But the empirical basis for making that recommendation doesn't yet exist. So in the absence of that science, my suggestion is to do some experimentation with these different tools, right? Like we know what the individual ones are, so begin to self-experiment and see which tools work best for you in which situations. This is not unlike what often happens in therapy, where a therapist will run through different kinds of exercises and tools, not knowing which exactly is going to work for the different clients they have. And so there is a bit of self-discovery there, which I know for the more scientifically, empirically oriented people in the audience might be unsettling, but that's simply where the science is. And so as someone who is elbow deep in this work, the exciting thing is that there's a lot more for us to learn. But there are things that I think people who are looking for help can do in the meantime to figure out what those combinations are for themselves.
Yeah, and it sounds like even if you're doing 1 or 2 of those things and you're feeling 10% better, not 50% better, well, that's better than engaging in some of the activities that we know are less productive.
Yeah, absolutely. And this article, which will hopefully be posted very soon online, it does give a healthiness score for these different 17 tools that we studied. and it shows you different combinations of tools that tended to work for people in the sample. What was also interesting about this study is that the clusters of tools that we discovered were really unique. So there was no model in the literature that would have predicted that things like exercise and mental time travel and affectionately interacting, touching with other people would cluster together in this way. And so I think there'll be some unique insights that people will have when they look at some of these data.
Yeah. Well, so I think we'll probably end up revisiting this at some point, but I want to zoom out a bit. I also noticed there's like lots of great questions in the Q&A. So maybe there's a way that we'll be able to provide so we'll touch on some of these at some point, or can provide some answers, later on. But I want us to keep moving to get to a few more parts.
Sure.
Maybe just really quickly to orient us, as you were even thinking about, writing this book. I know that you've talked a little bit about, where you're from and your relationship with your dad and his advice to kind of quote unquote going inside. Can you just give us a couple minutes on your background and sort of some of those experiences that really nudged you into wanting to write this book?
Sure. So, I had I think we all have interesting upbringings in our own idiosyncratic ways. Mine was unique, I think, in that I had a dad who encouraged me to introspect when I experienced problems from a remarkably young age. And what I mean by that is like 3-4 years old, when something bad happened, which at that age was, not getting the dessert that I wanted. You go inside, try to figure out why you're feeling this way. And my dad was not a college professor. He was not a college grad, but he had a voracious appetite for Eastern philosophy and psychology, and so he read about this stuff and talked to me about it throughout my childhood. And introspection was a common theme of our conversations. And so, as a little kid, I listened to my dad, still do for the most part. But I did what he told me to do growing up. So when I experienced any kind of problem, I turned my attention inward, try to find a solution, and I would, by and large, be successful in that introspective exercise. The solutions I came up with weren't always the best ones, but I didn't really get stuck ruminating or experiencing chatter throughout my childhood or adolescence. And then I got to college and I took my first psychology class at Penn, and halfway through the semester, we got to the topic of introspection. And what I discovered there is that, hey, a lot of scientists had spent an enormous amount of time doing research on this thing I had been talking to my dad about. But a lot of the time, this tool that I had valued and benefited from actually was serving other people not very well. So many people, when they experienced distress, they'd focus inward, and in doing so would actually make their problems worse. They'd end up ruminating and worrying in ways that really had strikingly negative consequences for their lives, for their health, their relationships, their ability to think and perform. And that just struck me as fantastically interesting. Why is it that some people, some of the time, really benefit from turning their attention inward to work through their problems and using language to do so, whereas other people crumble when they do the exact same thing? And that was a big puzzle for me, and it's what I went to graduate school to try to work on, and I have been ever since. And so the book really talks about what we've learned over the past 20 years surrounding this big puzzle of introspection.
Yeah, it's interesting that given that it can go one way or the other, maybe a more positive way based on some of your upbringing or a ruminating way. You talk a little bit in the book about maybe an evolutionary lens. Why would we have developed this inner voice in the first place, and why does it sometimes show up as chatter? And so I was curious if oftentimes the chatter piece of our inner voice is damaging. Why would we have evolved to have that piece of it too, and not just the more productive self-talk?
Well, it's a great question, and I could offer you some thoughts on it. And might be good to also zoom out a second just to give folks who are watching just a lay of the land and, self-talk, inner voice, chatter. So we often use language to reflect on problems or reflect on the world, I should say, and we can do that silently. And that's what I talk about as our inner voice. And the ability to use language to make sense of the world, I think, is a really amazing asset that distinguishes our species from really any others. We can use our inner voice to keep information accessible in our head. So if I were to ask you to memorize a phone number silently, you'd repeat it in your head, 20905, right? That's like the inner voice is part of our, what we call verbal working memory system. It's a crucial component of how the mind works. But we can also use the inner voice to do lots of other things like simulate and plan. So, before this conversation, even though I know you well, Dave, I thought I heard what you were going to ask me, or I thought you were going to ask me in my head, and then I would respond. I'd hear my response. I'd simulate. I'd plan. Our inner voice helps us do that. It also helps us control ourselves, like when we tell ourselves to calm down or try to amp ourselves up. And of course, we use the inner voice to make sense of who we are and what we experience. And so we use language to really shape our identity. That is an amazing set of capacities that this inner voice gives us, right? So it's a tool, but sometimes it's a tool that can get us in trouble, as is the case when we ruminate and worry. And I think there are many other examples of mental tools we possess that can be very, very effective in lots of situations, but aren't perfectly productive, and that when used in the wrong way, in the wrong instance, can get us into trouble. And that, I think, is what the story is when it comes to chatter and worry. It's a negative byproduct of an otherwise exceptionally valuable tool. And the good news is that we've not only evolved to have this inner voice, which serves us well much of the time, and I would say the majority of the time, but we've also evolved tools to rein it in when it goes astray. And so evolution is working in our favor here to optimize the way we use this tool in our lives. But it hasn't eradicated it just yet. Maybe eons from now it'll happen.
Well, look, one of the comments was about the role of, mindfulness or meditation.
Yeah.
Is that the type of thing you're talking about as something we've developed as humans to try to address the chatter?
Mindfulness is one tool, and I've been talking a lot about this book for the past month since it came out, and mindfulness comes up a lot, as does the message to be focused on the now. Maybe let's take a second to talk about it, because I think it's really interesting. There's this very strong message in the zeitgeist right now to focus on the present, be in the moment, and mindfulness is a tool that helps us do that. The human mind did not evolve to be in the moment all the time. We spend between a half and a third of our waking hours not living in the moment. We float away. We think about the past. We think about the future. And this is not something that I think we want to stop doing. The ability to travel in time allows us to do lots of amazing things, not just savor the past and fantasize about the future, but also learn from our experiences and try to plan and make sure that we're going to do well in, for the next presentation or so forth. So this ability to travel through time in our minds is also another amazing tool. When we get stuck traveling in time, which is often what happens when we experience chatter, we're stuck in the past, ruminating or worried about the future. One way of dealing with that is to recalibrate and go into the present. And I think that's what mindfulness does, and it can be very effective. But there's a universe of additional tools that exist to help us get unstuck. And these other tools don't necessarily involve bringing us back to the moment. Instead, what they allow us to do is travel in time more effectively. So tools that allow us to think about the past without getting stuck, or think about the potential problems in the future more objectively without getting, caught up in a worry spell. So mindfulness is a tool, but it is not the tool. And that's really one important theme of the book. There are no the tools. There are many different tools. And I think we'd all be better off if we knew what the broad universe of strategies available to us are.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I actually want us in a minute to turn more towards this kind of what do we do about it question. One other thing I want to address before that is that, I mean, I think a lot of times people think, well, in my head, I do this a lot, but I sort of doubt other people are in their heads as much as I am. And I know, like, when you had this interview with Anderson Cooper, he said he felt like you were describing him, which is probably a reaction, I'm assuming, that you get from a lot of people, that they're like, you've described their inner workings. You tell lots of great stories in the book that get at this. People who we would think would just sort of be above and beyond it, but who really struggle with it. One that really struck me was about Rafael Nadal, professional tennis player. He's won 20 majors, Grand Slams, best clay court player, in the history of tennis, and yet he's really suffers from this chatter. Do you mind talking about that story and his experience?
Yeah, I'm happy to. But before I do, let me just say, I think you touched on one really important take home from the book, which is one of the things I hope the book does is normalize the experience of chatter. I think it is something that is incredibly common. The data would support this. We all fall victim to it at times. And, because the voice in our head is such a private experience, it's something that we don't always talk to other people about. And so on the one hand, it's something that we're intimately familiar with, but on the other hand, it's something that we also don't know a whole lot about. Like, what actually is this voice in our head? How does it work? Why do we have one? Because it's so private, and because we don't tend to start cocktail parties with conversations. Hey, what's streaming through your head right now, Dave? What are you thinking about?
And you wouldn't want to know.
I wouldn't want to know. But what's interesting, maybe we'll get to this later, and I talk a little bit about this in the book. Social media starts the conversation often with exactly that prompt. So when you log into Facebook, it basically says, what's on your mind? Which is interesting. Like, imagine going up to someone else at a party or at the next ISR, mixer. It's like, hey, David Lamb, what's on your mind right now? I'm just looking at your picture, David. So I didn't mean to call you out.
Well, what it also makes me think of, Ethan, is that I saw some recent research showing that people are really bad at knowing when a conversation should end. Fortunately for us, we know how much time we have. We have an hour. But that if you ask people afterwards, were you happy when this conversation ended, or would you want it to be? There's very little agreement. And I think it's probably because some of that stuff that's going on internally, we just have norms about not expressing it. So it's hard to know.
Yeah, I'm gonna divulge. So while you were saying that, you know what I thought to myself?
What?
I looked at the people that are here, and I thought, how many people here are asking themselves if this conversation should end now or continue? So I'm hoping.
I haven't seen anything in the Q&A saying when.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So I revealed my vulnerability there. So let's go to Rafael Nadal, because I love his example. So as you said, one of the greatest tennis players of all time. And during the interview, someone asked him, so what's the hardest thing you struggle with on the tennis court? And just think about Nadal, right? He's playing the best players in the world. In some cases, these players are now over a decade younger than him. They've trained their whole life to beat him, right? What does he answer? He does not say it's the thing I struggle with is the fitness level and ability of the other players or my own endurance. He says, and I quote, the hardest thing I battle to do on a tennis match is battle the voices inside my head. And so, that to me is just really powerful and speaks to the role these voices can play in our ability to succeed at what we do, at work, in our relationships, and in life. And one of the most striking things about researching the book, actually, I had the ability when researching the book, I did a lot of journalism, interviewing lots and lots of people from really all walks of life, everyone from CEOs to Ann Arbor citizens and everything in between. And what was striking was the universality of this experience, that no matter what the achievement level was, everyone was struggling with something at times, and everyone could really identify and was actually really interested in talking about what this inner voice in their head was, and wanting to know why it sometimes runs awry. And people would also tell me about what they did spontaneously to control that inner voice. And what was interesting is that in many cases, people reported stumbling on tools to manage it that worked for them. They didn't know how they learned these tools. They thought of them as really kind of quirky in many cases, but they somehow figured them out. And I think Nadal's an example of that. So folks who watch tennis will know this about him, but he's famous for engaging in elaborate rituals before and during his games. So for example, like when he walks onto the tennis court, he always holds one racket in a particular hand, and he holds his bag of rackets another way. And then he puts it down at his bench, and he makes sure to face the crowd as he unzips his jacket, bouncing on his 2 feet. And then he lines up his water bottles on the diagonal to the court. And then during the game, before every serve, he picks his shorts out of his butt and curls his hair. And he's incredibly methodical about performing these rituals. And this is something he stumbled on, and he describes them as a way of providing him with a sense of order when he lacks that order in his head. And what the science shows is that actually many people revert to engaging in ritualistic behavior under times of stress. And when not taken to an extreme, these rituals can actually be productive. What they do is, when we feel like our mind is out of order, which is often the case with chatter, we don't have control, we compensate for that feeling of a lack of order by establishing order in our surroundings. And so by engaging in a behavior the same way each time, that helps us feel more in control, which can help us. And so, just one example, and many other people do these kinds of things.
Yeah, so let's talk about rituals maybe for a minute. And I was curious for everyone who is listening today to just to think about the various rituals that you engage in. Probably many of which that nobody else knows about it. They don't know that you do that. I know for me, it's like, as someone, I'll be vulnerable to and revealing my neuroticism. I love the number 4. I set my alarm to a multiple of 4. It's a topic of endless amusement and ridicule from my kids and wife doing this. I remember watching Michael Jordan when before the game would start, he would get the chalk and he would put it in his hand and he would sort of clap in front of the scorer's desk. And so you're kind of giving us the insight that we don't just do this randomly, that it does serve some purpose. And in the book, you do talk about placebos. And so my question is, even if we know that these things are like a little silly, or like it's not really changing what's happening in the universe, that it's still productive in some way. So yeah, could you help us understand that?
I can, but I have to admit, Dave, that I've known you for a long time very well, and I didn't know this about the number 4.
I've been hiding a few things.
And I find it amazing because I'm not just, ask me what my lucky number is. It's 4.
We need to talk.
Remarkable. So what the book is about the science behind these different tools. And one of the things that I hope it does is, by understanding the science behind these things, that puts us in a position to be a lot more deliberate about using these different tools in our lives. If we understand how they work, it may motivate us to be more likely to use some of these things and to use them in more effective ways. So yeah, there's some kooky things that we do that we've discovered can actually be quite useful. I mean, take things like a lucky charm. We've had lucky charms for, throughout time. There are traces of these talisman and other kinds of objects that we've endowed magical properties to, and that people really believe in. I think these are placebos, right? These are objects that have no medicinal properties, But what is interesting is that there's a large science of placebos which shows that if you believe something will help you feel better, for many different kinds of conditions, simply harboring that belief can actually bring that idea into fruition. And so there are these remarkable studies. We've done some of these things, other people too. We've given people, for example, people who have just been broken up in romantic relationships, right? Like struggling with some of the worst kind of chatter that many people experience, like rejection. Uh, in one study, we gave them a nasal spray filled with saline, right? Basically like salty water. But we told people in one condition that this was a painkiller, that if you inhale this nasal spray, it'll provide you with instant relief. It'll pass the blood-brain barrier and basically alleviate your emotional pain. With the caveat, we had IRB approval for this study, so we did a little bit of deception to study this. People felt remarkably better after taking the placebo versus taking a control spray. We saw it not only in their self-reports, we saw it in activation levels in emotional pain circuits in their brain. So we're doing the science to illuminate how these different things that we often do, often unknowingly, can or can't help us. And that's, I think, where the science can be really valuable. We've learned, for example, not just how Lucky Charms and believing in a healing and a healer, how that can help us. We've also learned how doing things as ordinary as taking a walk in a green space can help us. Like, we often report feeling better when we go for a walk in a tree-lined space. Like, why is that? Well, there's a large science which is now addressing that and pointing out the multiple pathways through which that can work by restoring our attention and by also providing us with an opportunity to experience emotions like awe. So, and I'm happy to elaborate on that if you want, but.
And I think you also write about how it's not just like you're going through Central Park or you're going through the R, like even people who live in cities and other ways can find ways to get the sort of positive effects of nature.
Yeah, so let's talk about nature really quick. So you can derive positive benefits. I learned about this research when I was living in New York City, and I was instantly horrified when I found out that enhanced exposure to green spaces predicts mental well-being. I'm like, oh my God, I'm in a concrete jungle. So there is research which shows you could benefit from green space exposure by watching videos of lush green terrain, or having plants around your home, or even hearing nature sounds. And one mechanism through which that works is by allowing us to replenish our limited attention, which is often consumed when we're worrying about something or ruminating. And so when we attend in a very kind of gentle, subtle way to the beauty of nature, that gets us to stop focusing really hard on the problems at hand, allowing our attention to recharge. But it can also promote the experience of awe, which I mentioned before, which I find just so interesting as a chatter fighting tool.
Yeah.
So awe is an emotion we experience when we're in the presence of something vast that's hard to explain. And so I felt it most recently when I watched the Mars rover land on Mars. Like, I, to be honest, still have trouble understanding how we figured out how to fly planes, let alone, ship SUVs between planets. And so when I watched that land, it was awe-inspiring. And what we've learned is that that's like the ultimate perspective broadener, because when you're in the presence of something vast that you can't explain, you and your own concerns feel a whole lot smaller by comparison. And that can help us rein in our chatter. And so that's another way we often get awe from nature. If you go for a walk in the Arb and you see these trees that have been there for hundreds of years, that can promote a sense of awe in people. And so those are others, these are tools that are all around us that I don't think are necessarily obvious to everyone in terms of where they are and how they work.
Yeah, I love this. So examples around rituals that can be used, about being in nature. Another one, maybe the area where you've actually done the most research too, just personally in your lab, is around distancing, distant self-talk. So maybe you could just mention this Solomon paradox and a little bit the research. And I love just the Malala story related to that.
Sure. So Solomon's paradox is a finding that Igor Grossman, a former student, and I worked on when he was here about a decade ago. And what it captures is the experience of it being much easier for people to give advice to others than it is for us to take our own advice. And we call it Solomon's paradox after the Bible's King Solomon, who was famous for being a wise leader who was not so wise when it came to his own personal life. Lots of concubines and palace intrigue that didn't have a happy ending for him. What we've learned is that there are ways of fundamentally Solomon's paradox is about when we have distance from a problem, it's easier for us to weigh in on it objectively. And what we've learned is that there are lots of ways that we can gain distance from our own problems. And when we gain that distance, when we're able to step back, it's easier for us to work through the weeds without getting stuck in them in ways that can help us get closure and move on with our lives. And some of the distant tools that exist are surprising, and distant self-talk is one of them. So distant self-talk refers to our ability to use language to coach us through a problem like we were giving advice to someone else. And so it involves actually using our own name to work through a problem. So, all right, Ethan, how are you going to handle this? Many people report spontaneously doing this, referring to themselves using their own name when they're under stress. And my favorite example is the one you referenced, Malala Yousafzai, the youngest person to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize. This was a young girl living in Pakistan who was targeted by the Taliban for being an advocate for young women's rights to an education. And she recounted during an interview several years ago to Jon Stewart what went through her head, what she said to herself when she discovered that the Taliban were coming to assassinate her. And she then narrated, so she says, well, I used to think, well, what would I do if the Tali would come to get me? And then I would reply to myself, oh, you would just take a shoe, Malala, and hit them. You're not going to let the Tali get the best of you. So she starts off by narrating the experience in the first person, right? And mind you, she's narrating the most stressful, chatter-provoking experience I think any of us could contemplate, someone coming to kill us. She starts off in the first person. And the moment where she gets to the part where, okay, now they're here, what would I do? She switches into coaching herself using her own name. And so we've done lots of research on this tool, and we find that when people are under stress, if you cue them to use their own name to work through a problem, it helps them perform better under stress. It leads them to ruminate less. You see these effects not only in their self-reports and their behavior, but also in their brain and in their body, how activated different emotion circuits are, and so forth and so on. And so that's one very, I think, simple thing people can do when they're experiencing chatter to get some mental space to help them work through it. And something I do quite a bit when I find myself going down the rabbit hole.
You'll use your name. You really.
Absolutely. With the caveat, and this is an important one, do it silently, not out loud, right? So I do it silently because we don't tend to talk to ourselves out loud. When you do that, you violate social norms in ways that can be problematic for other reasons.
Become a Seinfeld character or
That's right. You don't want that.
Yes. So just looking at the time, probably have about 9-10 minutes left, and I want to get this back to David in about 5 minutes. And so maybe we can recap just a little bit. And there's some questions in the chat, also in a Q&A about, okay, well, what should we focus on? Because we have done a lot, from even just like for a second on social media, on rituals, on nature, on distancing, on some of the 17 kind of things that you looked at related to COVID. So if we wanted to step back and say, all right, what is there, one sort of overarching takeaway, and or maybe two or three or four things that you think you'd love people to take away from our chat?
Yeah. So if you experience chatter, welcome to the club. Most of us do. It can have negative effects on our work, on our relationships, and on our health. but tools exist to manage it. One framework I use to break this down is I think of these tools as falling into three buckets. There are tools you can use on your own. There are tools that involve our relationships with other people and how to harness those relationships to our betterment. And then there are environmental tools. There are ways of interacting with our physical spaces that we can use to help us. And within those buckets, there are lots of different techniques. And so I talk about 26 different ones, for example, in the book. And the book really is about the science and the stories behind how these techniques work and play out in people's lives. But in the end of the book, I actually summarize them concisely to give folks exactly what Dave, you were just asking me for. Just here's your cheat sheet, if you will. A couple of examples in each bucket, things you could do on your own: distance self-talk, temporal distancing, thinking about how things are going to play out in the future, right? So COVID, right? Like, you're really stressed about this now. How are you going to feel 9 months from now? Our relationships with other people, find people to talk to who are skilled at not only allowing you to vent, but also broaden your perspective. Find people who are skilled at giving you invisible support. We haven't talked about it, but it's really important.
Will you say that what that is? That's a biggie.
Invisible support. So if a person doesn't, we often see those we know and love struggling, but they don't always ask us for help. And there's actually research which shows that if you volunteer your help when it's not asked for, it can backfire. The canonical example is of a parent, i.e. myself, trying to give my kids support. Let me help you with your homework, sweetie. Like, don't do it this way, do it that. And then they blow up on me. So when we volunteer support and it's not asked for, that can elicit reactance among those we care for. The good news is that there are things you could still do to help others in those situations. It involves helping them outside of their awareness. And I talk about how you can do that in the book. So relationships, those are the things you could do there. And then when it comes to the world around us, you can organize your spaces, engage in rituals, enhance your exposure to green spaces, seek out awe-inspiring experiences, embrace a lucky charm. There's no harm in doing that. And the science actually suggests that it can be beneficial, and like I do this with my kids. Like, my daughter has a boo-boo and I really want a Band-Aid. There's no open wound. The Band-Aid will do nothing. I give it to her nonetheless. And, it's going to make you feel better. And if she believes it will, the science suggests that it often does. So think about those three buckets and the tools that exist in each, and then you can, pick and play.
Wonderful. I'll maybe go 1 minute for this last question I see in the Q&A, which is, you wrote this book, you've had lots of conversations, over the last month in particular. Is there, a particular question that on the research side where you'd love to look at next?
Oh, absolutely. And we're doing it. It is all about these blends of tools and combinations. It is striking to me how much time we've spent, and I say this myself as well, studying individual tools really, really carefully, but looking at how these tools all come together as we live our lives. That's not something that we've spent a whole lot of time doing, despite acknowledging over and over and over again how important understanding how these tools come together actually is. I think that's a question that's central to understanding of human nature. And I think being able to answer that question will also put us in a position to be able to help people in the world much, much more than we can right now. And so we're devoting a lot of resources in my lab to doing precisely that.
As I look at the time, I think we should probably wrap up here in a minute, but my advice to you all is to buy the book. Lots of great stories too. Ethan wouldn't let me mark it, but I will. Around, LeBron James, Mr. Rogers, like lots of fascinating research, stories about people who are less well known than that, but that illustrate these, these important concepts. So we got about 3 minutes. Why don't I pass it back over to David to wrap us up?
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Ethan and Dave. That was fascinating, really wonderful conversation, incredibly timely. Congratulations on the book. Ethan. It's great to hear your additions to the book in this form. Thanks to Literati Bookstore for co-sponsoring and helping promote this talk. We had far more questions that we could get to, so sorry if we didn't get to your question, but there were way more that would take hours to get to them all, and indication of how much interest there was in it. So I encourage everyone to pick up a copy of the book, and you can do so by visiting literatibookstore.com. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. We had about 200 people online. It was great to see all the attendance and all the many questions that came in. I think everybody really enjoyed it, as I did. And I hope everyone took something helpful away from this talk, especially as we close in on the 1-year mark of living through the pandemic. Incredibly timely things to be thinking about. Thanks very much to our ISR communications and development teams for producing this event, and all of our ISR Insights series, which have been really fascinating. I encourage you to go look at the complete set of them. They're all available on the ISR website. We'll post a recording of this event on the website isr.umich.edu, and on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/user/UMISR. By the end of the day tomorrow. Feel free to share this with all your friends or watch it again. There was a lot in it. It was really, really fascinating. We'll also send a follow-up email to all of the attendees of this event with a link to the recording, so you can watch for that. I want to invite you to the next session of our ISR Insights speaker series, which we're also very excited about. We're going to have a distinguished panel of scholars to discuss James Jackson's continuing legacy and contributions to social and behavioral research on Black Americans, celebrating the incredible life of James Jackson. That will be on March 24th at 2 p.m. So I hope to see you all there. You won't want to miss that great recognition of James's life. So thanks again to Ethan and Dave for the fantastic job today. Thanks to all of you for coming, and hope we'll see you again soon.